All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to this Cognitive Science Colloquial series. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, David Ram, who is someone who studies the things that unite and divide us. He has degrees from Cornell and Harvard in systems and computational biology. He has held positions in 3 Ivy League universities. He's currently an associate professor at Yale, and he's a professor of psychology, economics, and management, which shows you how interdisciplinary his work is. His research combines very strong theoretical, experimental, and applied perspectives in order to study things like cooperation, and also in order to find ways to promote cooperation in domains of life where cooperation is lacking. And some of the methods he uses include observation, behavioral experiments, mathematical modeling, drawing from approaches across a variety of fields, including psychology, economics, evolutionary biology. And he also addresses a range of applications by including public policy, management, and law. His work has been published in more top journals than I can list here, and not just Science, Nature, and PNAS, but also journals across top journals across a wide domain of a wide range of disciplines. Disciplines like economics, management, psychology, and biology. And again, that speaks to the interdisciplinarity. So because he embodies interdisciplinarity, I thought he would be an excellent speaker for a cognitive science colloquium talk. He also, by the way, writes quite frequently for the popular press, including such venues as the New York Times or Wired or New Scientist. And in fact, Wired magazine named him in the list of 50 people who will change the world, so no pressure. And talking about what's wrong with the world, the reason I invited him was because the research I had in mind was his research on the evolution of cooperation. But then he told me, you know what, I've also been doing this work on fake news. I thought, wow, is that a timely topic? Let me think. So I couldn't resist, and I agreed. I asked him to talk about that, and if I judge from the size of this audience, it was a pretty good choice. And I think people are very interested about this. And without any further ado, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming our speaker.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks everyone for coming. Hopefully this will be of interest. As Dimitri said, I traditionally have studied cooperation, but then I sort of woke up the morning after the election and was like, what is happening in my world, and how do I do work that is relevant for what is happening? And this is one of the things that came out of that. So I think the topic of fake news doesn't need a huge amount of introduction. Everybody is talking about it these days. It's seen as a central factor in American social and political life. But the thing that I'm going to actually start by is defining what I mean by fake news. And it's not the way people like Trump use it. I don't mean anything you don't like. But specifically, by fake news, I'm talking about entirely fabricated content that is presented as if it is real news, either with the purpose of tricking people into believing it, or just the purpose of getting people to click on it and earning ad money. And so what I'm going to do in this talk is going to be sort of 2 halves of it. The first half is going to be a kind of basic cognitive science of how do we understand who falls for fake news, what makes people believe these patently false statements. And then the second half is going to be more applied in terms of what can actually be done to get people to be more discriminating. So for the first part, in terms of why is it that people believe fake news, there's a sort of dominant narrative that's been going on in the media and just sort of generally more or less all discussions that I've heard about fake news, which is things along this line. The real story about fake news is partisanship, or this article won't change your mind, the fact that my facts alone can't fight false beliefs, This is an idea that in the academic literature has been championed particularly by Dan Kahan, who's a law professor at Yale, what he calls identity protective cognition. But basically the idea is that when people are faced with, with news articles or headlines on social media, what you do when you think about it is what you might call motivated cognition. This is sort of going to be hypothesis one, this sort of dominant hypothesis for why people believe it. It's going to be summarized by this quote from the famous psychologist William James: "A great many people think they are thinking when they're merely rearranging their prejudices." And the idea of this account is that essentially people believe what they want to believe. People want to believe stories that align with their political ideology, and so even if they're kind of crazy or out there, people use their sort of cognition and their reasoning abilities, rather than to assess is this actually real or not, to talk themselves into why they can actually believe it. And so by this story, analytic thinking and reasoning is just used to justify the beliefs that you have beforehand and the behaviors that you want to take. And this position has gotten a lot of attention because it provides an actual explanation for people believing things that seem false, and also because in a certain sense it's if not exactly counterintuitive, it's counter to the sort of classical approach to thinking about reasoning, which is what I'm going to call hypothesis 2, the classical reasoning approach. If by this line of argument, reasoning, what it does is it facilitates the accurate, the accurate formation of beliefs. It's represented by a quote from Pascal, another famous scientist of days of yore. It says, "Thought constitutes the greatness of man." And so, by this account, when you think about things, you try and figure out what's real or not. And so, in order to tell what's fake versus real, that requires sort of cognitive control and reasoning. So rather than reasoning just justifying the beliefs you have already, reasoning and analytic thinking are used to inform your beliefs and behaviors and try and lead you towards the truth. And so these two different perspectives on cognition in the role of sort of, or in the context of information consumption, make two different sets of predictions about how analytic thinking, that is the extent to which people tend to think carefully about things versus just going with their first responses, these accounts make different predictions about how analytic thinking is going to relate to one's tendency to fall for fake news, that is, one's ability to differentiate between fake and real news. So the motivated cognition account, that is the believe what you want to believe and talk yourself into it account, would suggest that for stories that don't align with your ideology, so if you're a Democrat for stories that favor the Republicans, you don't have any motivation to believe those stories, and so it should be, if you think more about it, then you'll just be able to use your normal reasoning abilities and figure out what's fake and what's real. So the better you are at analytic thinking, the better you should be at telling fake from real for stories that you don't have a motivation to believe. But for stories that are aligned with your ideology, for politically concordant stories, there you have a motive to believe it, and so there you should see a reversal, where the more analytic of a thinker you are, the more likely you are to believe the fake stories that you want to believe, the less good you're going to be at distinguishing them. And there's some evidence for this kind of account. For example, a famous study of Dan Kahan's asks people how much risk do you believe climate change poses to human health, safety, or prosperity, and then he gets some measure of basically how good they are at analytic thinking. And what he sees is for Democrats, the analytic thinkers are more likely to think that climate change is a problem than the less analytic thinkers. But for Republicans, where this is a sort of politically discordant statement, it's like in line with a lot of the Republican ideology to say climate change is not the problem. And there you see this opposite result, where people that are more analytic are actually less likely to believe in science. Believe in science, and particularly to believe in the scientific consensus regarding climate change. So that could be one possibility for fake news. The other possibility, this sort of classical reasoning approach, is going to say, well, for stories that you don't have a motivation to believe, and for stories that you do have a motivation to believe, it doesn't matter both ways. the more of an analytic thinker you are, the better you should be able to distinguish fake from real, because it's just about, do you want to bother to think carefully about it or not? So in this paper, Who Falls for Fake News, the Role of Analytic Thinking, Motivated Reasoning, Political Ideology, and Bullshit Receptivity, which is available at this link, we sought to test between these sort of different competing hypotheses. There's 3 different studies in the paper. I'm going to tell you about one of them that is representative. So in this study, we got 800 people to complete our survey. We didn't use college undergrad. We recruited people from all around the country using this online labor market, Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is a standard tool in the psychological sciences these days. It gives you a much more diverse subject pool than what you would get from undergrads, no offense. And we pre-register everything. If you know what that is, great. If not, don't worry about it. And it's not a representative sample, but it's actually not that bad. So in a forced choice question of would you prefer Clinton or Trump, we ran these in July, I think. It was 60% said they would prefer Clinton, which was pretty close to Trump's overall approval ratings at that point. And so then what we have them do is we present them 30 headlines in Facebook format, they are of 3 different varieties that we, so first of all, half of them are fake stories we got off Snopes.com or factcheck.org. Those websites said were not true, and half of them are real that we just sort of selected actual real headlines that seem sort of similar in spirit. And then we also had a set of people rate all of these items for, if they were true, how good would they be for the Democrats versus the Republicans, and so then we can score them as ones that are sort of pro-Democratic headlines, pro-Republican headlines, or neutral headlines. And so we balanced the 3 different types. And just to give you a flavor of what this looks like, on each page people saw something like this. They saw a picture, they see the title, they see the first sentence, and they see the source. That's not true. If it was true, that was rated as good for the Democrats, but bad for the Republicans. And then we asked, to the best of your knowledge, how accurate is the claim in the above headline? And then we also asked them about how likely they would be to share it. I'm not going to talk about the sharing decisions in the first half of the talk. In the second half of the talk, we'll return to the sharing. So that's one example. Here's another one. This one would be pro-Republican or anti-Democrat. Also not true. Okay, we had people read these and rate them. And so then for each person, we could say sort of how discerning were they? What was their media truth discernment score, which was the average accuracy rating they gave to real stories minus the average accuracy rating they gave to fake stories. So it's basically how different are the average ratings that you're giving to fake versus real. And then we wanted to see how that varied with analytic thinking. So to measure analytic thinking, we also had them complete a standard task in the literature, the cognitive reflection test. And this is a set of math problems that have intuitively compelling but incorrect answers. So the most famous example is, say, a bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? If you're like most people, the thing that immediately pops into your head is 10 cents. And if that was true, then the bat would cost $1 more than the ball, because it would be 10 cents and $1.10, but they wouldn't add up to $1.10, they would add up to $1.20. So 10 cents is not actually right. And if you stop and say, okay, 10 cents popped into my head, either I can just write it down, or I can stop and think, well, is that actually right? And then you realize, do the algebra, and you realize it's 5 cents. So basically, we say that the more of these questions you get correct, the more deliberative you are, the sort of more of an analytic thinker you are. So now we want to ask, what's the correlation between CRT and media truth discernment? And remember, these 2 different accounts make differing predictions. So we're going to start with this sort of shared prediction that for both accounts say, for stuff that you don't agree with, it should be the more analytic you are, the better you are at telling fake from real, just because you're applying your reasoning to figure out what's up. So we're going to start by testing that prediction. And so to look at that, we're going to look at how the ratings of Trump supporters for stories that are good for the Democrats, and Clinton supporters rating stories that would be good for the Republicans, or bad for the Democrats, and this is good for the Democrats or bad for the Republicans. And so here what you're seeing is the average, so I take all of the people that supported Trump, and we have them say how well did they do on the CRT, and for each of those different sets of CRT scores, these people are doing poorly, not very analytic, these people are doing well, very analytic. We say, how good are they at telling fake versus real? And in all these plots, the size of the dot is proportional to the number of observations. This is saying among the Clinton supporters, or the Trump supporters, there were a bunch of people that got a 20% on the CRT score, a bunch of people that got an 80%, not very many people that got them all correct, etc. But the key point here is there is a very strong positive correlation where the better you are, the more analytic of a thinker you are, the better you are at telling fake from real. And then the same thing is true for Clinton supporters rating pro-Republican stories. So, as predicted by both accounts, for stuff where there's no motivation to believe it, being more analytical makes you better at figuring out what's going on. Now we move to the key test where there's divergent predictions. So what happens when Trump supporters are rating pro-Republican stories, or Clinton supporters are rating pro-Democrat stories? This is where the motivated cognition account says you should have a reversal, and being smart makes you more easily fooled because you're convincing yourself. Whereas the classical reasoning account says, no, you should see the same thing. And indeed, in both cases, what you see is even for stuff that aligns with your ideology, even for stuff that you're motivated to believe, being a more analytic thinker makes you better at differentiating fake from real. And I should say that, so this is sort of consistent with the classical reasoning hypothesis and totally not consistent with this motivated cognition account. And so I'm here doing Trump supporters versus Clinton supporters, but you can also do it with Democrats versus Republicans, or people above versus below the midpoint on a political conservatism scale, and it looks the same. So you can divide, however you sort of do this slicing to say what's concordant or not, you get the same thing. That is, this is support for this classical reasoning approach. Another thing I'll just note is that if we look at sort of the ability to discern fake from real, now forgetting about analytic thinking and just comparing Clinton supporters and Trump supporters, for neutral stories where there's no motivation one way or the other, the Clinton supporters are better at discerning than the Trump supporters. And then this is also true both for the Republican consistent and in particular for the Democrat consistent. So for the ones that the Clinton supporters have the most motivation to believe, that's actually where they're best at telling fake from real. So it's like the opposite of the motivated cognition story. And just as an other point, if you just look at how all these different demographics predict the ability to discern fake from real, what you see is younger, so older people are better at discerning, women are slightly worse, more educated people are better, more conservative people are worse, people that are more likely to think randomly generated sentences are profound. This is my co-author, the pseudo-profound bullshit receptivity scale. So this one is actually the better you're able to tell what's actually profound versus made up, the less you fall for fake news, and then the CRT correlation that we saw, and whatever you put them all in a model together, it's basically the same. But so an interesting point to note here, actually, the reason that this is worth noting, is that you might think that CRT, so analytic thinking, is just a proxy for how educated are you. But this says it's not. So first of all, the correlation with CRT is like twice as big as the correlation with education. And second of all, in a model where you do both control for both of these factors at the same time, you still see a big effect of CRT. So this analytic thinking isn't just about being educated. It's saying holding fixed how educated you are, still the more you tend to engage in analytic thinking, the better you are at telling fake from real. Okay, so to summarize this first chunk, it looks like people who are inclined to go with their intuition, go with their gut, not stop and think, are the people that get fooled by fake news, and there's no support for this motivated cognition account, which of course raises the question of what is different between judging of these fake news stories and the climate change example, where you do see this motivated cognition going on, or other things like being an anti-vaccine person or not believing in evolution, all kind of looks the same as the climate change, and this fake news really looks different. So one possibility is that these fake news stories are just a lot simpler. Like, you don't need any great expertise to kind of like think, kind of at face value, these seem kind of ridiculous. Maybe I should assess it. Whereas for climate change, no one is able to, that's none of us anyways, are climate scientists, not able to directly assess the evidence. And so maybe there's more room to convince yourself of whatever you want, because it's less prima facie obvious what's going on. Another possibility is that these fake news items are judging single items of information. And so maybe when you're presented with one item of information, being more analytic makes you better able to figure out whether it's true or not. But when you try and form an overall opinion about a subject, that's where being a more analytic thinker makes you better at basically picking out the specific pieces of evidence to consider which already fit with what you believe. And sort of in a related way, it might be that it's necessary, so if you're a Republican, it's like an important part of your identity to say climate change is not real. And so therefore, analytic thinking will motivate you to do that. Whereas for any of these individual fake news items, it's not sort of required to be a good Republican to believe that, you know, Trump tricked Obama or whatever. So that may be also less motivation there. And one just thing to point out here is we don't differentiate in these studies between analytic thinking versus just general intelligence. And it's an important thing for future work to test how much of this is general IQ versus just the tendency to go with your first response. And the reason that's important is that to the extent we want to try and design interventions to train people to be more deliberative when they're thinking about news, it's very hard to change IQ, but it's not that hard, or it's not impossible anyways, to change people's cognitive style, that is the extent to which you deliberate or not. So I'm hoping that it really is about that sort of deliberativeness rather than baseline education. Okay, so the general conclusion from this chunk is that when we think about why people believe fake news, it's not that. It's not this, oh, people just believe what they want to believe. And so in some sense, that's, I think, a quite optimistic finding, because it suggests that getting people to be more discriminating isn't a totally lost cause. It's not just that people are going to believe what they're going to believe. It suggests that more, it's that people just kind of aren't thinking carefully about it. And so if we could get people to think more carefully, maybe that they would be better. So this sort of shifts to the second section of what can we do in light of this to try and sort of combat fake news. And so I'm going to start by talking about the main intervention that Facebook has been deploying, at least the only thing that's visible to us as users of Facebook, which is putting these little disputed by third-party fact-checker labels on stories that sites like Snopes and factcheck.org have said are not true. Facebook claims they're also doing all kinds of things with their algorithms to make it better, but like, A, it's totally opaque, we don't have any idea what they're actually doing, and B, as we saw in the wake of that recent, the Las Vegas shooting, where all these fake news things were the leading articles on Facebook for at least a couple of days, whatever they're doing with the algorithm, like not so hot. Okay, so I'm going to tell you two different studies that say that this little label thing also is not really probably going to be the solution to the fake news problem. The first one, assessing the effect of disputed warnings on perceptions of fake news accuracy. So what we did in this study, because of the clear policy implications, we wanted to be really sure that whatever we were saying was right. So we ran the same experiment 5 times and had over 5,000 people in the experiment. And what we did is we had them read a set of headlines, again, half fake, half real, half good for the Democrats, half good for the Republicans. And the control condition, that was it. And they just rated the accuracy of all the items. And then in the treatment, we put that little warning label, the Facebook warning label, on half of the fake stories. And the thing that motivated this study was thinking that one of the features of fact-checking is, in order for something to get fact-checked, somebody has to say, hey, this might be fake, let me spend some time to go and research it and see whether it actually is or not, and then put it on Snopes or whatever. And so that takes time and effort, and it's vastly easier to produce fake news than it is to fact-check it. So it seems like only a small subset of fake stories are ever successfully going to get tagged. So we wanted to understand what are the consequences of tagging stories, of tagging fake stories, both for the fake stories that are successfully tagged and also for the fake stories that are missed. And so we're going to start by showing you the average fraction, or the fraction of stories that were rated as true, the fraction of fake stories that were rated as true in the control. So it was around 18% versus the ones that actually had the warning on them in the treatment. It went down to maybe 15%. So the warning does do something. Again, this is not consistent with the whole motivated cognition thing, which would say people will just ignore the warning if they don't want to believe it. But it's a small effect, like, I think a 3 percentage point decrease in accurate fake news is not going to solve the fake news problem. So already we're not super optimistic here. But the real point here is something that we've called the implied truth effect, which is that if you're labeling some fake stories, that may suggest to people that everything that's not labeled has actually been verified. And so fake stories that don't have a label, we are anticipating that the perceived accuracy of those stories might increase. And indeed, that's what we observed. And it's a small effect, but this is also a small effect. So the increase for the untagged stories is about a third as big as the decrease for the tagged stories, which means if you're successfully tagging less than a third of the stories, this intervention is on average increasing perceived accuracy of fake news. So that's not great. And it's also worse because if you look at subpopulations who are particularly vulnerable to fake news, that is, who are at baseline worse at telling fake from real news, it gets worse. So for example, Trump supporters, who as we saw in the last study were worse at differentiating fake from real news, for them the warning effect is a bit smaller and the implied truth effect is a bit bigger. So now it's something if like half the stories are missed, it's going to get worse. And now the last group, which is something that we used a machine learning algorithm to uncover, say, of all the different subgroups in this data set, who was the person, what's the subgroup for which there was the sort of biggest difference in the effect of this warning. And what I identified was you guys. That is, the youngest people in the sample, age 18 to 25, because no one was under 18. And so the young people were the worst at baseline at differentiating between fake and real. And now when you look at the effect of the warning, this actual warning effect is now smaller than the implied truth effect. And so this kind of like backfire negative consequence was even bigger than the baseline warning. And this is particularly concerning because this age group is the group that relies most on social media as a source of news information, and also in a survey at the end of the study indicated the greatest confidence and trust in social media as a source of information. So like, that's not great. Another thing that's not great about the warnings is there's this big literature in cognitive psychology going back to the 70s showing that if you read a statement, it will subsequently make you more likely to think it's true, even if it's not true, for example. And so we wanted to know if the same thing was true of fake news. So we did this experiment where we had about 1,000 people. First, we showed them 12 stories, half fake and half real, and had them say how likely they would be to share each of them on social media. Then they did some distractor tasks and answered random surveys for 5 minutes. And then we showed them the 12 stories from the first round along with 12 new stories they'd never seen before. So now, in this stage, we know half of the stories we showed them once already, and so they've been familiarized with it, and half of the stories are new, novel ones. And so I'm going to show you the fraction of the stories, of these fake stories that were judged as accurate. And what you see is, if they're seeing them for the first time, it's around 18%, as in the last study. But just having read it once, like 10 minutes earlier, jumps it up to 24% or something like that, which is a pretty huge effect size from just having read it once. And it was true even for stories that align with your ideology. So that means Clinton supporters reading fake stories about Clinton are becoming more likely to believe them, for example. And so we wanted to know, is this effect, does having the warning on there change this? So if the first time when you see a story, you see it, but it has a warning, so you should rationally know, oh, I should discount this to some extent because it's probably not true. How does that impact this exposure effect? And so we did another version where everything was the same, except all of the fake stories had warnings on them. So this is sort of best possible case for the warning. Imagine it worked and they managed to tag all the stories. What we found is that it did make people overall a little bit less likely to believe it, but still, having seen it once before, so these were the ones that they saw in the familiarization stage with the warning on them, and these are ones they've never seen before without any warning, they still believe the ones that they saw more, even though when they saw it, it had something on it saying this probably wasn't true. So this suggests that these exposure effects are sort of low-level cognitive heuristics that you can't override just by knowing that it's not true. And we also did a 1-week follow-up where we brought them back a week later, and we found that the effect was still there and had even compounded. So if you see it twice, that makes you believe it even more, as much more than seeing it once as once did to 0. So there's sort of a linear increase in belief across multiple exposures. So the sort of implication of this is it's very important to prevent fake stories from getting seen in the first place. And in general, arguments to try and say afterwards, oh no, that story you saw, that's not actually true, are like not super effective. We also tested one other thing, which Facebook has started doing a little bit, which is making the source of the article salient. In the standard Facebook format, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, it does say where it's from, but in teeny light gray letters in the lower corner that is very easy to not pay any attention to. So we compared what happened if you did this versus when you show the story, you show a big logo. This is a true story, by the way, a true headline. So we wanted to know, does making the source salient increase in people's discernment? Hopefully it would make them believe the real stories more and the fake stories less. But what we found, so this is the fraction of headlines that are judged as accurate, that are either fake or real, as a function of whether they're in the control or in the one where we stick the logo on there. And what we found is adding the publisher logos did totally nothing, which we really were shocked about. But like, so the fraction of fake stories that were seen as accurate and the fraction of real stories that were seen as accurate was basically exactly the same, regardless of whether there was no logo or there was a logo stuck on there. And we're sort of digging more into this, but the implication seems to be, because it's well known that people believe information from credible sources more than from less credible sources. The implication of this is that people don't really see the mainstream news sources as particularly more credible than the like random ass websites that are publishing fake news stuff. This is true on average over all the sources. There were some sources, like at NPR actually, for this one story, it did seem like sticking NPR on there made people believe it more. So the follow-up we're doing for this is looking at the level of individual sources. Does the general credibility of the source predict the impact of the logo? But overall, it suggests that making sources salient also is not that great. So this hopefully concludes the negative portion of the talk, which is everything Facebook is doing is bad. And the question is, okay, so what is something that might actually be effective? And so what we were thinking is, it seems like, as we were sort of discussing in the first craft, a lot of people are just sort of not considering accuracy when they're interacting with stuff on social media. There was this study that showed that the total in Facebook engagement for the top 20 election stories, leading up to the election, the ones that were fake actually got more engagement than the ones that were real in the final stretch of the campaign. So that, great people obviously are not taking accuracy too seriously. But the studies that I presented at the beginning suggest that this is more a consequence of inattention than it is of willful ignorance. And so if the problem is just people aren't really thinking about accuracy, when you're on social media, you're not always thinking, well, how accurate is this? You're thinking, oh, that's funny, or oh, that's cool, or oh, it'd be great if that was true, or whatever, and then you're sharing it. And so the implication of this is that if you were to make the concept of accuracy salient to people, it would make them more discriminating. So we test this in a couple of different studies. In the first one, the control condition is like this. We show them a bunch of headlines in the same format. We just ask, if you were to see the above article on Facebook, how likely would you be to share it? Great. And the control, everything is exactly the same, except on every page, first they answer, to your best of your knowledge, how accurate is it? And then, if you saw, how likely would you be to share it? The idea being, if you make them answer the accuracy question before they answer the sharing question, it should make accuracy sort of top of mind, and therefore make them pay more attention to accuracy. So what I'm going to show you here is the average likelihood of sharing that the people indicated as a function of whether they were in the control, where they were just making sharing decisions, or the treatment where they were also rating accuracy for fake real news and for real news. So what you see in the control is people are a little bit discriminating. They're a little bit less likely to share fake stories than real stories, but not that discriminating. Whereas when you ask about accuracy before each one, it makes them like half as likely to share fake stories, and only a bit, half as likely to share fake stories, and only a little bit less likely to share real stories. So this is a big improvement in their discrimination, in their sharing.
So tying it back to the fact that people will believe things that they're familiar with, do you think this will not override the effect over time?
So this relies on people having their own internal understanding of what's accurate and not accurate. I think your point is things like exposure effects can mess up those understandings. So fair enough, but I feel like the fact that people do actually, so, in the thing I showed, like a single exposure increased it from 18% to 24% or something like that. But still, people, I think even with a reasonable number of exposures, by and large, people are not that bad at telling what's fake versus real. At least that's what these experiments suggest. It's, they're not great, but they're not terrible. All the stats are significant, but to your point, maybe, so there's no interaction with political concordance. That is to say, this works just as well for headlines that align with your ideology as not. So again, not this motivated cognition account. Also, there's no interaction with Clinton versus Trump. So it works just as well for Trump supporters as it does for Clinton supporters, even though the Trump supporters believe the headlines overall more. This sort of improvement in discrimination that you get from this is about twice as big as the improvement in discrimination as you would get if you would put a warning on every single item based on another study that we did on the warnings. So this looks way better than the warnings. Okay, so we want to understand from a sort of cognitive perspective, what's the mechanism that's driving this effect? And there are sort of two different possibilities that we considered. One is, at baseline, lots of people don't care about accuracy. When we ask them about accuracy, they think, oh yeah, I guess really, I guess maybe accuracy is important. They want me to think accuracy is important, so fine, I'll modify my behavior to, share less accurate stuff. But the alternative is, basically everybody thinks it's important to only share accurate things. They're just asleep on the job. Also, these are my kids. By this story, it's not that we're sort of creating some demand effect, making people think, oh, we should start caring about accuracy. It's just they don't think about it. And when you put accuracy up there, they're like, oh, yeah, right, I do care about accuracy. I just kind of wasn't, okay, fine, well, let me be influenced by that. So we want to test between these possibilities. In terms of the not caring about accuracy account, we asked at the end, how important is it to you that you only share news articles on Facebook if they're accurate? And so if the treatment was working by sort of pressuring people to start caring about accuracy when at baseline they don't care about accuracy, you should see a treatment effect. That is, people should respond higher to this question in the treatment than in the control. But this is the distribution across the sort of 5 different levels of answer. And what you see is that in the control in yellow and the treatment in green, totally no difference. And in both the control and the treatment, 60% of the people say it's extremely important to only share accurate things, and something like 90% of people say 4 or 5. So this suggests that a vast majority of people actually think that it's important to only share accurate things, even though they're maybe not really paying attention to that when they're actually doing the sharing choices. So to provide direct evidence for that, what we did is we took all of the stories and we had people, like a different set of people, rate them on how accurate they thought the story was, how good, if it was true, it would be for the Democrats or Republicans, as I mentioned before, and then also whether they'd seen it before, that is how novel versus familiar it was. We didn't ask about how funny or entertaining the story was, which is another reason people share stuff. We're going to do that in the next version of the run. But the idea is now for each story, we can say how overall accurate is it, what's its partisanship, and how novel is it. And then we can say, how do those features of the stories predict their likelihood of getting shared in the experiment that I just showed you. And sorry, here's a regression table, but I'll walk you through it. So first, these coefficients are showing in the control. So when when accuracy is not salient, people are just doing what they do. You see that there's a strong positive effect of concordance. So the more the partisanship of the article aligns with your partisanship, the more likely you are to share it. There's totally no relationship with accuracy at all. And there's a positive relationship with novelty, where the more novel something is, the more likely they are to show it. And we visualize it here. So this is showing the level of political concordance. So over here, it's aligns with your ideology. Over here, it doesn't. And the likelihood of sharing, you see there's a strong positive correlation where there's more sharing of concordant stuff. And over here, we have accuracy. And what you see is it's totally flat. Like there's no relationship between how accurate something is and how likely they are to share it. And so now the question is, how does this reminder about accuracy change this? And so what we see is for all three measures, there's a significant interaction with treatment, which is to say the relationship between each of these factors and sharing is different in the treatment relative to the control. And in particular, what you see is that in the treatment, there's less of an influence of political partisanship. The correlation goes from 0.22 to 0.15, so it maybe cuts it by a third or something like that, makes partisanship less important. And suddenly accuracy goes from not mattering at all to mattering the most of any of the three factors. And it's in particular because the stories that they thought were not very accurate are shared substantially less. And so this suggests that the manipulation is indeed making accuracy salient and having accuracy enter people's judgments in a way that they just sort of didn't think about it otherwise. But this is a very strong touch in the sense that we're like on every story we're saying how accurate is it, how accurate is it, how accurate is it. There's no way Facebook is ever going to implement that. It's going to be a huge pain in everybody's butt. And so the question is, would this work with a lighter touch? And so for the second experiment, the control is the same. We just show them 24 stories and have them rate, or 24 headlines, and rate how likely they would be to share it. And then the treatment is just once at the beginning of the study, the very first thing that happens once they enter the study is it says, first we'd like to pre-test an actual news headline from 2016, 2017 for future studies. We're interested in whether people think it's accurate or not. We only need you to give your opinion about the accuracy of a single statement, then we'll continue on to the primary task. We show them one politically neutral story and have them rate how accurate they think it is. And then they go on and they do the same thing at the control. They adjust for each story that they see 24 headlines and say, will you share it or not? So this is just asking accuracy once in the beginning in ostensibly a different context. And what you see, again, is the likelihood of sharing on social media as a function of control versus treatment for the fake or real news. And what you see, this looks the same as the other one, where in the control they're a little bit discriminating, but not that much. And now what you see is just asking about accuracy once at the beginning doesn't reduce the sharing of real news at all, but does reduce the sharing of fake news a bit. And if you compare the results where we asked about accuracy on every item to this version where we just asked once at the beginning, what you'll see is that in terms of the fake news, this reduction was way bigger than this reduction. But in terms of the real news, it was also being harmed by this ask on every item, whereas it wasn't affected at all by this ask once beforehand. So in terms of discernment, that is the ability to correctly classify fake versus real, the two manipulations are actually exactly equally effective. Because the thing is, it's not just important that people don't share and don't believe fake news, it's also important that they do share and do believe real news. And so if that's our goal, is trying to maximize the difference between fake and real, this works just as well. Something that we didn't investigate in these studies, but that we are going to do in a follow-up, is looking at how much of the motivation is just, I didn't think about it, and now you reminded me, so okay, I care about accuracy and I'm going to do it, versus how much is, I think other people care about accuracy, and when you're asking about accuracy, it's not that it's changing the extent to which I care about it, but it's changing the extent to which I sort of realize that other people would think that I would be, think something bad about me if I was sharing fake news. So we want to investigate this reputational dimension.
Do you, I'm just wondering, do you also look at the accuracy on like the TV too, the news represented on the TV as well?
So no, it's a really good point, and I think that like the thing that emphasizes is there's a distinction between fake news, as we're defining it, which is totally whole cloth made up things that didn't happen. Like the Pope did not endorse Trump, just like that is a fake thing, versus super biased coverage of real events. And that's maybe like, Breitbart, for example, is not actually a fake news site. They're not whole cloth making things up in general. They're just giving really, really biased coverage of true events. And so that kind of stuff is probably, and I think that's most of what's going on TV news also, is not so much the whole cloth invented things, with a few notable exceptions, but more the biased coverage of real events. And that's honestly probably a bigger problem than the fake news. It's just this was a sort of more practical place to start. But I think that that's something that we are super interested in as an important direction for future research. Okay, so what I like about this is it is very, the distance between this and the real world application is small, I think. This is sort of very straightforward implication of this, which is Facebook should do a thing where just, every couple hours or something like that, pop a little something up and say, hey, how accurate do you think this is? And a natural cover story would be, help us improve our algorithms. Like, how accurate do you think the story is? And then if they throw the data away, they don't even need to use it to inform the algorithms. The point is just asking people will get accuracy on their mind. And the thing that's great about this is that it's a totally distributed solution. That is to say, it doesn't rely on some centralized authority who says what is and is not true, which a lot of people contest. As you may not be surprised to know, we asked how much do you trust third-party fact-checkers, and the Trump supporters were overwhelmingly not trusting of the third-party fact-checkers. It also doesn't have this problem of implied truth. It doesn't require fact-checkers to keep up with fake news. It just kind of relies on people's own ability to distinguish if they were to stop and think about it. And it's also essentially free because you don't have to be hiring anybody or doing anything. And as I said, it seems in our studies at least that it works even for concordant stories. It works for Trump supporters as well as Clinton supporters. And I didn't show you these data, but also in terms of that question at the end of how much do you think, how important do you think it is to only share accurate stuff, even the people who say they don't think it's very important to only share accurate stuff, this treatment still makes them just as it increases their discrimination to the same extent. There's a few limitations about everything that I've been talking about. First of all, this was all done using these workers from this online labor market. Not a nationally representative sample, which is always great, but real expensive. Although for this particular application, it's not obvious to me that the nationally representative sample is actually better than MTurk in terms of representing the people that we care about, which is the subset of the population that's spending lots of time on social media sharing fake stuff. And these are people that spend lots of time on the internet doing weird little tasks. So we don't know who the good targets are, but it's not obvious that MTurk is actually a bad sample. In all the studies that I showed you, there was no echo chamber effects. That is to say, we always were showing people an equal match of pro-Republican versus pro-Democratic headlines. And it's important to check how these results would change if you were only seeing stuff that was consistent with your own ideology, as is the case for most people on Facebook. The biggest limitation, of course, is that it was all done in this sort of experimental lab type setup where people know it's an experiment and there's subjects that we're recruiting, rather than sort of in the wild as people are using their Facebook accounts. But we're endeavoring to set up and do some actual field experiments on Facebook to see how this stuff generalizes. And these are all important directions for future research. So just to summarize, the first set of studies suggested that analytic thinking is actually used to inform people's judgments, not just to justify what they already believe, at least in the context of these fake news headlines. There's numerous reasons to think that this dispute warning that Facebook is doing is not going to be a great solution, and that just seeing stories is problematic because it induces you to believe them more subsequently. And so left to their own devices, people don't really think about accuracy when they're making sharing decisions. But if you just get people to reflect a little bit on accuracy and make it top of mind, then they start taking it into account much more. And so that suggests this sort of pretty straightforward intervention that hopefully we can talk Facebook into trying. So this is, and if that worked, it would be decentralized outreach. So this is all work that I did with my collaborator, Gord Pennycook, who was really awesome. Those are all our kids hanging out in the background. Yeah, Gord, I feel extremely lucky to have started working with him right around the time all this fake news stuff came out and sort of spawned this whole research agenda for us, which is really quite exciting. Also, the prior exposure study was with my colleague Ty Cannon at Yale, and Evan Collins is a high school senior that just emailed me and was like, hey, I'm going to be taking a class at Yale this summer, can I volunteer in your lab? And I was like, yeah, sure, why not? And he was awesome. And he like programmed all this stuff. So advice to the high school kids, you know, can never hurt to just email random professors and be like, hey, can I volunteer in your lab this summer? And you might get some cool experiences. And so everything except the last study, so the stuff on making accuracy salient, improving sharing, we haven't written that up yet. But the 3 other studies that are written up are all available online. The Who Falls for Fake News is the one about the correlation with CRT. The Assessing the Effect of the Disputed Warnings and Source Salience is the one about assessing the effect of disputed warnings and source salience. And this is the one about how just seeing things makes you subsequently believe them more. So thanks very much, and love questions.